to episode 267 of Late Night Linux, recorded on the 29th of January 2024. I'm Joe, and with me are Phelim.
How's it going?
Graham.
Good evening.
And Will.
Hello.
We've got a special episode for you today. It's a chat with Chris from Explaining Computers on YouTube. And if you've not seen his channel before, then you should definitely check it out. It's a mixture of hardware and software. There's quite a lot of Linux. Not everything is, but there's a fair proportion of it is Linux. And it's nice and calm and not manic. Highly recommended. Before we get to that, I just wanted to put a call out. We're looking for a co-host for one of the Late Night Linux family shows who knows about the cloud, AWS, Azure, GCP, ideally with some experience of more than one of those. So if that sounds like you and you've got a reasonable mic set up, then send in a recording, joeressington@gmail.com. Doesn't have to be too long, just a couple of minutes telling us about who you are, what your experience is, that sort of thing. Right, let's get straight on with our chat with Chris then. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks for asking me on.
So I reached out to you because of your video promoting Linux and End-User Manifesto, where you say there's been a lot of manifestos over the years for various open source and Linux things, but this is your desktop Linux manifesto. And so I thought we could go through some of the points on that, because I broadly agree with most of what you said.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, be an advocate, not a gatekeeper. What did you mean by that?
Yes, I mean, this very much is a manifesto for the user. I mean, as you said, there's been many manifestos in the past. They'd been about distros and documentation, things like that. And I wanted something about what I thought current users could do to help Linux be more promoted. And by being an advocate, not a gatekeeper, I was saying that there is still in parts of the Linux community, there's a sort of like, oh, it's only for us technical people, you know, and you often see in forums, people will say, I'm a newbie to Linux, how do I do this? Well, you shouldn't be trying. If you don't know what you're doing with Linux, go away. And so it was really trying to say, all of us who use Linux and champion Linux, let's help everyone else to use it. If you think about, say, the Mac community, then they're almost evangelical about promoting Mac and Apple and everything. And yet, in the Linux community, there are a lot of really positive people who help other people out a lot. But there is this group who are sort of, Linux is for us, and if you're not technical, you shouldn't be using it. And I've seen that so many times. I mean, I've made a lot of videos about Linux over the years. And so I've read thousands and thousands and thousands of comments. And it just struck me that it's quite sad, because we're all really, if we're using Linux, we want to use Linux, and it helps all of us if more people use it. But you see that sort of, you know, sometimes users who wish to keep it for a certain group. And I think that's rather sad. So I say advocate rather than gatekeep.
How much of that do you think is Linux users, and how much is it just people in general? I'm guessing from your YouTube videos, obviously everyone is very technically minded, but there must be a fairly good split between Linux and Windows and Mac on there. Is it noticeable in the Linux community about having this kind of holier-than-thou attitude?
I think it is, because I run a channel which is a general computing channel, so I cover Windows, I cover more Linux than most general computing channels, I cover Chrome OS, FreeBSD, all sorts of operating systems. And you don't get the sort of, well, you shouldn't be using this operating system if you want technical, from Windows users, and you certainly don't get it from Chrome OS users. I think there is a certain, you know, Linux was created for this purpose, you know, and you shouldn't need to use, for example, I don't know, I did a video on Zorin OS recently, and there were lots of people on that, or some people said, well, no one needs this at all, because you should just use Ubuntu and put any particular tweaks in yourself to the desktop. That is, I think, is a good example of gatekeeping, rather than this realizing that some people actually quite like the fact there's a distro designed for people who are less Linux competent. And I think it is a Linux community thing. And I want to stress, I think most people in the Linux community are really positive and do help people out. But there is a group. I must have had over 100,000 comments now on YouTube. And there's a group of people over, 16 years of the channel now, you can see do this. And that's one of the things really got me making this particular video.
I think you're right. And I really think it's a noble mission. But I feel like Linux attracts these kinds of people. It's a bit of an anthropic principle. People are attracted to Linux because of that kind of the way that they can be so partisanal about things like distro choices. And it's really difficult to convince them otherwise.
Yes, I think that's true. And it fascinated me that on a video about these points, there were people who proved every point I talked about in the comments within an hour. And they clearly didn't know they were doing it. And yet most people are going, yes, you're absolutely right. And there were also people who said, I do things like that. And I now realise I shouldn't be doing that, should I? They were genuinely going, that is sometimes me. So there were two different types. There were people sort of hadn't thought about how their behaviour in forms and things appeared to others and what it might mean to a newbie. And there were people who were clearly oblivious and would do it regardless because they didn't want other people using it,
I think it ties into your second point, be tolerant of other users' choices.
Yes, I think that's very true. I mean, I've seen this particularly when you show any sort of desktop, as people always going, well, no, you should be using this desktop or that desktop, and that desktop is terrible. And we all have different choices and we all make choices. And again, if we could have a bit more tolerance of that, but there'd be less vitriol in the community. I suppose I'm most concerned about people getting into it, because if people can't get into Linux, the community won't grow. And if the community doesn't grow, the support won't grow as we would all like it to do. And again, you don't see this so much in the Windows community, in say the Mac community. You do see it in Linux, and there are very different desktops, as we know. We have different choices. Let's all welcome what each other are doing and be happy we're all being Linux users.
I mean, you must get quite a lot of pushback for using Linux Mint, for example. Why don't you just use Ubuntu? What's wrong with that?
Yes, exactly. How can you possibly be serious about computing and use Linux Mint? I've had that many times, certainly, yes.
I think what's also very disheartening is it's a lot of beginners that are targeted. As soon as you see a beginner pop up on a forum and they're saying, well, I'm thinking of using this distro, everybody piles in. And that's really disheartening.
Yes, I think that's very true. Very true.
Yeah, I saw that recently on Mastodon. Someone was talking about a distro for someone new, and someone said, what about Linux Mint? And then someone said, but not Cinnamon. You want to use Mate for that. And it just didn't get it. Didn't get why that was an issue.
Yes.
Accept that many people cannot currently use Linux. That is something that Phelim here is guilty of at times, I think.
I put that in because I would like to do everything in Linux, but I know I can't. I need to have the Adobe suite. I use a product called Lightwave for 3D graphics, which in fact will have a Linux version this year for the first time. But the Adobe suite in particular, and PowerPoint for some of the work I do, there are good alternatives to some extent. But Photoshop in particular is very difficult still. And there are many people who do hybrids, virtual machines or dual booting, whatever it is. I run all sorts of different configurations. Linux is the first operating system I boot in the morning. It's the last one I close down at night, but I often run Windows in the middle. And that doesn't make me a bad Linux user. And yet some people clearly have that view. It does. And how dare I suggest, that you can't do everything in Linux.
Well, it's like my niece. She needed a laptop for college work, and that is CAD work that she's going to be doing. And there's some very specific programs that they're going to teach her at college. And there was literally no point me trying to say, I'll install Linux for you. She needed Windows for that. And that's just how it is. I think one of the programs doesn't even work on the Mac. So she literally needed Windows. And it's a hard thing to accept, but it's something that we really ought to, I think. I think you're really bang on with this one.
It causes so much debate. And again, on the video I put up, there was one particular person who was adamant, you can do everything you can do in Photoshop in GIMP. And it's like, well, you haven't even got CMYK workflows for print work. So if you're going to do any professional print, you stop before you've even started, And I think sometimes there are Linux users who do bits of work with programs. And if it works for them, that's great. But they don't seem to appreciate there are other bits of programs people need to use. It's like, for example, PowerPoint compatibility. For a lot of my life, I worked as a freelance lecturer, and clients just required PowerPoint. There weren't debates about this. It was if you weren't running PowerPoint, and you can, again, you use LibreOffice and various other alternatives, WPS Office, but they aren't absolutely compatible. And you put two decks of slides together and they crash for a client, you simply can't do it. And it's sad, but it's the reality of the world.
Yeah, I think it's a case of some Linux users confusing the fact that just because they can do everything they want with Linux, they think that everyone can do it.
Yes, that is completely the case. Or that you could do everything, but it would be just as easy. If I could find good alternatives to, After Effects on Linux and all the editing software, and particularly Photoshop, I would very, very happily work in Linux. And I have produced some of my content entirely in Linux. I've done whole videos on a Raspberry Pi, so everything was obviously done in Linux. It can be done, but if it takes you 3 times longer and you're doing it professionally, you have to sometimes say, well, actually, I need to do the thing that allows me to sleep at night.
This is also linked to what I think is the effectiveness of advocating for Linux and free software. I've seen lots of times where people have made incredible contributions to open source, but they perhaps use Windows or they use Mac OS, and all of that good work is kind of thrown out in the community because they simply only see the software that they're using in other ways. And it should be the same with this. If it's the difference between someone sometimes using a free software alternative to something, that's an added bonus that you wouldn't have otherwise, more people using the software. And so criticizing people for this is just wrong.
Yeah, I think that is so true. And you see people who say they'll use Windows for something. It's, well, we can't take you seriously talking about Linux now ever because you made a video about Windows. And it's like... or why I frequently show installs of typically Linux distros, often on SBCs, sometimes on desktops, x86 machines. But I often do produce the actual boot media in Windows. And the reason I like to do that is because most people watching, if they've never used Linux before, will be more familiar with that. So it's about accessibility. But it does make many other people go, obviously this can't be serious. You haven't even started in Linux. And it's
why are you using Etcher and not DD on Linux?
Yes, I know. Oh, the debates I've had about DD on videos in the past few months have been extraordinary,
What kind of thing?
I did a video about free cloning applications.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't actually mention DD, but I also said, be aware DD, it's not smart. It'll copy all the non-used space. You can't copy a live drive. It doesn't resize partitions. Oh, yes, it does. Well, clearly it doesn't. You can use it with other tools. You can get to the same result. But compared to the other alternative out there, it's not an ideal tool. If you want to use it, that's great. But there was a body of people going, no, you shouldn't be using things like Clonezilla, or I can't remember the other ones. I tried about 20 or 30 programs out and got the ones that work best across operating systems and did mention DD and did mention its limitations, but people don't hear that bit. Mm-hmm. It's like the point you just made about as soon as they've seen you run Windows once, obviously you can't be serious about Linux and open source software. And you can, you can do both.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/LNL. Tailscale is an easy-to-deploy, zero-config, no-fuss VPN that allows you to build simple networks across complex infrastructure. In just a few minutes, you can have PCs, servers, phones, tablets, and other devices all over the world connected as if they were all on the same LAN. Recently, I finally got round to setting up off-site backups at my parents' house. It's something I'd been meaning to do for years, but thanks to how simple Tailscale is to set up, my ZFS snapshots get sent over there every night, and I feel like there's one thing I can stop worrying about. So if you want the benefits of WireGuard without the hassle of configuring it manually, don't take my word for how easy it is to set up. Give Tailscale a go yourself. Support the show and go to tailscale.com/LNL and try Tailscale out for free for up to 100 devices and 3 users with no credit card required. That's tailscale.com/LNL.
I completely agree with you. There's definitely people out there who are just out to, I don't know if the word is troll or whatever, or, special club, don't want anybody else in. The only thing I would see is, if you're using FOSS software, you have the ability for anybody to use it. Whereas oftentimes when people are coming with a proprietary piece of software, that's a lockout that most people can't afford. Or if somebody says, I need you to edit this in Visio, say, or whatever, that's quite an outlay because you now have to get new OS, you have to get a new Office package. Whereas it's the opposite way around with FOSS stuff, that if you were able to get to use the package, then you're now in the place where anybody can contribute. How would you square those two against each other? Or can you even?
I suppose it would come down to computer software is there to enable us to get things done, isn't it? To get work done, whether it's creative work or hobbies or business or whatever. And so I would always start with ultimately the application, the use case. And clearly, what you describe is, I suppose, people being locked out of certain use cases if they can't use a bit of proprietary software. And I guess in that circumstance, Linux does give us the opportunity to do something else, because there is always an alternative in Linux. It might not be as good as the alternative available proprietary sometimes. I think it's like the point that was made earlier about someone having a laptop for college and they had to have it with Windows to run certain CAD software because that's what was being taught.
Yeah, you're kind of, no choice.
That's right. A lot of these situations are literally a no choice, a commercial no choice or an education no choice. And in some cases, a use case no choice. Some things simply aren't available, and this is really why I wrote the whole manifesto, because the more people who use Linux, the less likely that is to be. So we need the community to grow and the use of Linux to grow, so the people who make bits of software that might be cut out will more likely to move across the platform, or people will write free and open source alternatives. So I guess my squaring is really to say, I think the more people who get into this wonderful thing called Linux, the better the situation will get, and the less likely what you've just described is actually to happen.
Do keep in mind that Phelim is a person who uses a custom ROM on his phone with no Google apps. He likes the misery.
I'd just like to point out, I never advocate that anybody follow me, by the way. Unless you like kneeling across thumbtacks. But,
Yeah.
I mean, there is one other way I would look at this. Now, obviously, we know that Android is quite big, and you mentioned that in your video as well, but you don't take it into account. But what if a lot of the proprietary software companies go, all right, we'll come over there, but you now have to have a lockdown ROM. We use something like Secure Boot and code signing and all that you can only have that if you have a kernel that is now signed, so you can't do any things that modify that, or have a graphics driver that's different, or all these things. Is it worth getting to that point if we end up with a situation where we're so locked down like an Android system, or an unlocked Android system, obviously, that we get all the features that make Linux so good, the whole openness and things like that, are taken away in order to win over this other chunk?
I can't see why that would happen. I look, for example, to, say DaVinci Resolve, from Blackmagic Design. That's a great, fantastic piece of software, amazing video editor, available for Linux. And there are certain limitations on what distro they would like to run it on, but you can get around those without too many problems. They're managing to deliver a piece of very high-end professional software, either free or paid, without putting those sort of constraints in.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't like to see those constraints going in. I think there is always going to be an issue about makers of proprietary software saying the problem with Linux, too many distros, we can only support certain ones. I think that's much more likely where the constraint will be, as opposed to them saying we really want to lock down beyond what is currently the norm.
I think that's fine if they do that, if they pick their one or two that they like. But as long as they don't block the others, like they don't say, no, you can't run it because you're not on Fedora or Ubuntu. But say a banking app, I can't run a banking app on my unlocked Android phone, for instance, because it'll go, it's not secure. My phone is not rooted, and it's probably more up to date than lots of other phones that are allowed to have it. And I just think that's maybe a sketchy place to be.
But I think what you're describing is if you go against the norm for the platform, you might have problems. And I think the norm for the platform in Linux is not the situation of being locked down. And therefore, I think if a proprietary publisher of software decides to make a Linux version, it would be ludicrous for them to make it under those sort of circumstances, because no one's going to use it.
I agree.
You have to accept Linux is open before you actually decide to make Linux applications. And, we have got some good Linux applications which are proprietary, which you can use, and they aren't putting those sort of constraints on. So I would be surprised I can't see why a company which embraces Linux for its software and starts to make a proprietary version would then go, but I'm going to stop people using it, because it wouldn't be in their interest.
That is something that is part of your manifesto, though. Campaign for Linux versions of major applications.
Yes.
That must have got a lot of pushback.
It did get some pushback, yes. Well anticipated. Again, I think it's back to almost the first point where we were talking about being an advocate, not a gatekeeper. People who wish to be a gatekeeper to keep Linux for certain people doing certain things in a certain way do push back against that. I mean, we all know if the Adobe Suite and Microsoft Office were available for Linux, then use would skyrocket, because you'd be able to sell hardware with the reason we don't see much hardware sold with Linux on is because of those two. Many manufacturers have tried, and some do still offer a Linux version of a laptop or something, but they know there are constraints. That is why I think if we could try and get more people offering versions, and to some extent this will become a smaller issue over time as more stuff becomes cloud-based, and even at the moment we can use Office cloud-based on a Linux system the way you couldn't 10 years ago. Not quite as good as a full version, but there are options coming up. But you're right, there was pushback on that point.
Spread the word about how Linux has improved. You make the point that it has massively improved in the last sort of 10 or 15 years.
And that is something I see so much in comment. Whenever I do a video that involves Linux, which is probably 40% of my content in different ways, there are people who go, well, I tried Linux back in, 1998 or whatever it was, and it was rubbish then. And it's like, yes, it's changed a lot. Well, you can't use any video graphics code in Linux ever. Well, you can these days, So I think there are people who have gained an opinion based upon a test they did a long while ago. And if that colours their personal experience, fair enough. But if they then spread it around so that the people who might not have tried it go, well, there's all these people saying it doesn't work, it really doesn't help the Linux if actually, well, it does work. And there are still cases where, a trackpad driver doesn't work properly or something. But by and large these days, support is very good. And that isn't the perception that gets put across, I think, sometimes, not just in the community, but more broadly in the community.
But hang on, I don't want to use a command prompt, and that's all Linux is.
Yes,
hear that.
I know. And I sometimes do videos where, particularly say the Zorin OS videos, I never go near the command prompt, but you'll still get people saying, it only works with a command prompt. And I've done a video showing installation, putting in other applications, going to all the standard things you can do for most people on the computer, all they need, and you'll still get those comments, even though you've just seen in front of your eyes and it isn't true.
Because I remember, Will, when you were in charge of the Ubuntu desktop team, one of your big goals was to make sure people could use it without the terminal if they wanted to.
Yeah, and I think that situation is very true. It's interesting to hear that there are people who were unaware or have chosen to be unaware that has changed. But yeah, I use the terminal for SSHing into, for example, a Raspberry Pi or something stuck away in a cupboard. But for the rest of the time, I barely touch the command line these days.
Oh, no, I'm the opposite. I do everything I can with it. But that's just out of choice. I don't have to. But I just like to because it's quicker for me.
Yeah, and also there's the point that Windows still has a command line as well. If you want to run, say, disk part in Windows, it's a command line. If you want to edit the registry, there are places you go near a command line in Windows if you want to do more technical things or work in a certain way. And yet that gets quietly ignored in this debate about you have to use a command line all the time in Linux, which, you clearly don't.
I think all of this is connected to the idea that Linux is more difficult to use than Mac OS and Windows, and I just don't think that's the case anymore.
I completely agree with that.
I think it can be if you want it to be, and that's part of the beauty of it. If you want to run Arch, for example, and start from just a shell effectively and build it all up yourself, you can do that if you want to, or you can install something like Ubuntu or Fedora or all the other distros and just get going and have a really easy time of it.
Yeah, Linux these days, for lots of people who just want to do basic computing. I see so many people who want to basically, get online, do a bit of email, watch a bit of media, and do a bit of word processing maybe. And you can do that with a Linux system these days, straight out the box, can't you? And it works really, really well. And yet there are people who just do not want to accept that. And I suppose the positive side of this is I also see lots of comments of people doing just that. People who've got, an older piece of hardware sometimes, and they've installed Linux and gone, wow, got great new life to this piece of hardware. I put Ubuntu on it, whatever it is, and they're really happy. And those voices sometimes get drowned out because, again, people will leap and go, well, you shouldn't be happy because this is not what you should be doing. And it's like, you've got happy people here. Let's,
I think this comes back to a point you made earlier, Chris, which was that it's okay for people to use Windows and Linux. If they want to try something out on Linux and it doesn't work, that's okay. We don't need to get on their case about it. They can do that on Windows. But to take that fear away, and it's not just the fear of the unknown, but it's the fear of being criticised for not knowing something.
Yes,
that perhaps keeps people back. And you see the flame wars that erupt on forums and in comment section, and just think, I don't want anything to do with that, and I won't even bother. So to make it the norm that it's okay to try, and it's okay to do a particular task, whatever that be, browsing the web, writing emails, whatever, on a Linux desktop is perfectly fine. Congratulations. You're on the road to a newfound use of computers, and you should be celebrating that instead of criticising.
Your last point, give back where you can. I would add a little something to that, and that is give back or get involved where you can.
Yes, I made that point to say, if you can give a contribution to a distro, everything costs money, doesn't it? People's servers and everything, if you can support. But I would totally agree. I would widen that out. It is, you can give back in all sorts of ways, and that might be getting involved, recognize this is a two-way street.
Yeah, whether it's helping with translations or even supporting new users once you get a bit more experience yourself. There's loads of ways that don't involve code.
And this is back really to almost the point we started with about being an advocate for Linux, isn't it? You can give back to a distro by just helping other people with the distro, by how you talk about it, how you behave in response to it. And again, to be fair, you do see that. Again, I think back to the comments I see on my own channel. You often see people who will do help out others who are getting into something. And Linux has got some of the most passionate people in computing we ever see, who are really keen about what they're doing and about what's going on and helping others. And yet you get the other group who are just for us. And if you're not technical and you can't code, you shouldn't be doing it at all. It's a unique thing, isn't it, as an operating system?
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. What do you call an endpoint security product that works perfectly but makes users miserable? A failure. The old approach to endpoint security is to lock down employee devices and roll out changes through forced restarts, but it just doesn't work. IT is miserable because they've got a mountain of support tickets, employees start using personal devices to get their work done, and executives opt out the first time it makes them late for a meeting. You can't have a successful security implementation unless you work with end users. That's where Kolide comes in. Their user-first device trust solution notifies users as soon as it detects an issue on their device and teaches them how to solve it without needing help from IT. That way, untrusted devices are blocked from authenticating, but users don't stay blocked. Kolide is designed for companies with Okta, and it works on macOS, Windows, Linux, and mobile devices. So if you have Okta and you're looking for a device trust solution that respects your team, support the show and go to kolide.com/late-night-linux to watch a demo and see how it works. That's kolide.com/late-night-linux. On to a bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to late-night-linux.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to get in contact, you can email show@latenightlinux.com. While we've got you here, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you about single board computers, because a lot of the videos you do are about various fruit pie this. And,
Indeed. About 2 out of 5 of my videos are single board computers.
Yeah, so you're a good man to ask about this. Do you think that x86 has sort of caught up at this point? Your daily driver machine is it an N100 or something?
It is for a lot of the time, yes.
Yeah, which is a silent, fanless box that is pretty energy efficient. Have we got to a point where x86 can do the job of SBCs for most users, do you think?
I think we are heading towards that point. I think that the thing that's really happened is x86, we are getting some more energy efficient chips and we're getting some lower cost systems. You can buy an x86 mini PC for $100 plus now, which is, you couldn't think of that 2 or 3 years ago. But also ARM SBCs are getting more and more expensive.
Yes.
So you look at, for example, a Raspberry Pi 5, which you can now equip with an NVMe SSD adapter and things, and it works really, really well. But you're into a computer which is well over $100 to set it up, or you could go and buy an M100 system, all pre-case, everything installed on it. And this debate has been going on now for a long time. And also we've got lots of old x86 hardware, particularly as we get towards the end of Windows 10. A lot of corporate mini PCs that have been rolled out the last 10 years coming on the market, reconditioned, very good value. And so the SBC marketplaces, I think that the Pi bubble has burst. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I think when the Pi came along, it was the $35 computer, and there were lots of clones at a roughly the same sort of price. Not many things went above about $50 to $60. And these days, not many things are priced below that, and many go a lot beyond it once you've added the storage and some sort of case and some sort of power supply. And so in some ways, the SBC marketplace is going back to what it was. It's computers for certain types of industrial use, certain types of maker use. If you want GPIO, you probably want an SBC rather than an M100 and adding on a GPIO USB board or something. So to some extent, the SBC has gone through a life cycle because it was about making computing accessible. It was about a platform for many people. That's how they got into Linux. They got their Raspberry Pi and they were still running their Windows PC, and they could use their Raspberry Pi because if they messed it up, didn't matter. They hadn't messed up what was at the time, £600, £800 computer. And now we've got much cheaper x86 hardware, and we've got more expensive SBCs, and also the compatibility thing. I think, Raspberry Pi have pushed to maintain absolute compatibility across boards, but that is becoming a real issue. The way they changed, for example, the camera controls on the Pi in the last version of Raspberry Pi OS, so that all the old stuff didn't work anymore. So 90% of your tutorials out on YouTube and elsewhere no longer function. That was a real problem, because if the Pi is an educational platform, You can't just suddenly go, oh, it's all right, we've upgraded it. If you just do this and this and this and this and this and use this and go into these instructions, you've lost most of the people you're trying to get at. The industrial users, they're perfectly happy. They'll just go, okay, new library, no problem, we'll use it. And so I think that the Pi thing was always going to have that limitation eventually, where compatibility became a problem, where they had the choice of, do we keep the price point or do we push up the spec? And they've gone for pushing up the spec. I think the fact Linux distros have got more and more heavy over time, that's a problem. I did a video not long ago, I showed the original Raspberry Pi OS running on a Pi 1 versus the latest version. And the original version is still usable, and the latest version isn't, because it's just so slow. And that isn't the SBC manufacturer's fault. It's just because Linux has grown and it no longer runs very well on very low-end hardware, and therefore that again favors x86.
Yeah, I do feel that the kind of shift to the industrial customers is just a bottom line thing. That's where they're making their money.
Absolutely. And why do we have two HDMI connectors on the Raspberry Pi 4 and 5? It's because they use as thin clients in call centers in many parts of the world. That's what it's there for, and they have responded to the industrial market. And it doesn't mean they've abandoned the maker market. I almost think that these days it's the microprocessor market, the microcontroller market that's building up. So the Raspberry Pi Pico is where a lot of the exciting maker stuff is. Particularly now that you can add VJ output or HDMI output to a Pico, you can connect to a keyboard. There's all sorts of hacks. And makers like to do cool things like that. You can run BASIC on the Pico and also control GPIO at the same time with a display, the keyboard. The Pi was about excitement in computing, wasn't it? It was an adventure to try something new and different. And the more expensive that the SBC market gets, the less it has that. I think you have to have a price differential between your board you play with and your, if you like, proper computer. And that doesn't exist quite the same way anymore.
RISC-V, I've got to ask you about this. You managed to make a whole video on a RISC-V board. You've got more RISC-V boards than anyone else I know of, pretty much. So where is RISC-V now and where's it going, do you think?
I think RISC-V at the moment is very well established in terms of microcontrollers, and in things like controllers and SSDs and the thing that does autofocus on your camera, things like that. So embedded cores are established. There's over 1 billion cores in use now. Most people will have a RISC-V core somewhere in their phone or a storage device. So the people who say RISC-V won't work, that clearly isn't true. RISC-V is starting to find a place in the data center, and I think that will continue across the next few years. And it's a point where we could just about make end-user devices, certainly low-end computers, the things that compete with the things like the M100 board we were just talking about. We're not quite there, but we're not massively far off. Phones with RISC-V, tablets with RISC-V, well, they do exist. They're very much development platforms. And I think we are within a year or two of RISC-V being a very serious competitor in the sort of lower-end phone and tablet space. We know Google is going to support Android on RISC-V, so that will grow. And clearly this is driven as much by geopolitics as it's driven by the technology.
Yes.
Because if in certain parts of the world you can't get access to x86 chips and you can't get access to certain other technologies to support them and software, you'll go somewhere else. And that's what will drive RISC-V without any doubt. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because I think, there are billions of computers in the world. The fact most of them have got an x86 or an ARM processor is not a terribly good thing, particularly in terms of, we have a lot of restrictions in both of those markets. And so I think the world is big enough to have at least one more pretty dominant platform. And I think RISC-V is going pretty well in that respect. At the moment, RISC-V in terms of end-user boards is more constrained in terms of software development, particularly Linux software development, than it is hardware. 18 months ago, it was the opposite. So there's still more we could get out of current hardware once the work has been done in terms of software development. And that will happen. This is going to be a good year for end-user RISC-V development platforms, which will become for sale for everybody else platforms.
Well, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure to be on your show.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. We'll be back next week when it'll probably be news and stuff. But until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Phelan.
I've been Graham.
And I've been Will.
See you later.